The village of St. Mary Mead wore its Christmas finery with the dignified restraint befitting an English country community that had weathered 5 centuries of Yuletide celebrations. Garlands of holly and ivy adorned the ancient stone church, and fairy lights twinkled in the windows of the cottages that clustered around the village green like children gathered for a bedtime story. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her sensible woolen coat and carefully navigated the icy path leading to St. Mary's Church. The evening air carried the promise of snow, and the bell tower stood silhouetted against a darkening sky that was the particular shade of grey-blue she associated with her late mother's best china. Called Mrs. Dolly Bantry, waving enthusiastically from the lich gate. Her husband, the somewhat pompous Colonel Bantry, followed at a more sedate pace, his military bearing only slightly compromised by the festive scarf his wife had insisted he wear. "Good evening, Dolly." Miss Marple inclined her head with the gentle courtesy that was as much a part of her as her white hair and shrewd blue eyes. Indeed, it seemed the entire village had turned out for this most traditional of Christmas Eve celebrations. The church was already filling with familiar faces. Dr. Haydock, the local physician, escorting his elderly mother, Mr. and Mrs. Price from the bakery, young Raymond West, Miss Marple's novelist nephew, who was visiting for the holidays with his wife Joyce, and countless others whose lives intersected in the complex web of village society. "I do hope Vicar doesn't go on too long," Mrs. Bantry whispered conspiratorially as they made their way inside. "You know how he tends to get carried away during the Christmas sermon." Miss Marple made a small, non-committal sound. She had observed over many decades that complaints about sermon length were as much a part of English church life as the sermons themselves. The interior of St. Mary's was a vision of candlelit beauty. The ancient pillars seemed to glow in the warm light, and the scent of pine boughs mingled with the faint mustiness that spoke of centuries of worship. The church choir, resplendent in their crimson and white robes, were taking their places in the chancel. Among them, Miss Marple noted with interest, was Miss Lavinia Fullerton, the new music teacher who had arrived in the village only 3 months prior. She was a striking woman of perhaps 45, with the kind of handsome, refined features that suggested good breeding and better education. Her voice, when she had sung at the Harvest Festival, had been quite remarkable. A rich contralto that had moved several of the congregation to tears. "That Fullerton woman does put on airs," Mrs. Bantry murmured, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Did you hear she claimed to have trained at the Royal Academy? Though I have my doubts." Miss Marple filed this information away with the same careful attention she gave to all village gossip. In her experience, the small details of daily life often painted a more accurate picture than the grand pronouncements people made about themselves. The congregation settled into their pews with the rustling and coughing that always preceded such services. Miss Marple found herself seated with an excellent view of the entire church. Not, she would have insisted, because she was nosy, but simply because she took a natural interest in her fellow parishioners. In the front pew sat the Fortescues. Hugh Fortescue, a successful London solicitor who had retired to St. Mary Mead 2 years ago, and his much younger second wife, Celia. They made a handsome couple, though Miss Marple had noticed that Mrs. Fortescue wore the brittle, bright smile of a woman who was not entirely content. Between them sat Mr. Fortescue's daughter from his first marriage, Marian, a plain girl of 23 who worked as a librarian in the nearby town of Much Benham, several rows back. Gerald Barton slouched in his seat with the particular grace of the chronically dissatisfied. He was a man of about 35, possessed of considerable personal charm and no visible means of support beyond a small inheritance that was, according to village speculation, rapidly dwindling. His relationship with the Fortescue family was a subject of some interest. He had been Marian's suitor the previous summer, but something had caused a rift, and now he paid marked attention to the stepmother instead. The organ's opening notes silenced the congregation's murmurs. Reverend Leonard Clement, a kindly man whose faith in human goodness sometimes exceeded his understanding of human nature, rose to welcome them all. Miss Marple listened with half her attention, while the other half continued its habitual observation. She had learned through long practice that people revealed their truest selves not in their words but in their small unconscious gestures. Marian Fortescue was twisting a handkerchief in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Her stepmother Celia kept glancing at Gerald Barton, who was studiously avoiding her gaze. Dr. Haydock seemed preoccupied, checking his watch twice in the space of 5 minutes. And Miss Lavinia Fullerton, standing in the choir, appeared to be staring at Hugh Fortescue with an intensity that seemed quite at odds with the festive occasion. The carol service proceeded with its familiar beauty. Voices rose in, "O come, all ye faithful," and "Hark!" The candlelight flickered over upturned faces, casting shadows that made everyone look mysterious and somehow more vulnerable. It was during the 3rd verse of Silent Night that Miss Marple first noticed something was wrong. Lavinia Fullerton's face had gone chalk white. Her hands, holding her carol sheet, trembled visibly, and her eyes, those expressive, intelligent eyes, were fixed on Hugh Fortescue with what could only be described as absolute terror. The carol concluded, and Reverend Clement stepped forward to deliver his Christmas Eve homily. But before he could speak, Lavinia Fullerton moved. She walked down from the choir stalls with an odd, dreamlike quality, as though she were sleepwalking. The congregation watched in confused silence as she made her way to the center of the nave, directly beneath the wooden crucifix that had hung there since the 15th century. "I must speak," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife through silk. "I cannot bear it any longer." Reverend Clement made a gentle, confused gesture. Her voice was stronger now, echoing in the vaulted space. "It must be now, before God and all of you as witnesses." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm. Marion Fortescue half rose from her seat, her face a mask of shock. 23 years ago, Lavinia continued, and now tears were streaming down her pale cheeks. I killed a man. I have carried this sin with me every day since. I thought I could escape it, thought I could hide in this peaceful village and find redemption. She swayed slightly, and Dr. Haydock moved forward, his medical instincts overriding the general paralysis that seemed to have gripped everyone else. I killed Arthur Penrose, Lavinia said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. I pushed him from the cliffs at Scarborough, and I let the world believe it was an accident. And now... She collapsed before she could finish the sentence, falling gracefully to the stone floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The church erupted into chaos. People rushed forward, voices raised in shock and speculation. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the unconscious woman, checking her pulse and breathing. Reverend Clement called for calm, in a voice that was itself anything but calm. Through it all, Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded quietly in her lap, her keen eyes missing nothing. She had seen many strange things in her 70-odd years, but a confession of murder during a Christmas carol service was certainly a novelty. Yet something troubled her, a small nagging detail that didn't quite fit. Lavinia Fullerton's confession had been dramatic, certainly. Desperate, undoubtedly. But had it been true? And if it was true, why confess now? Why here? And most intriguing of all, why had she been staring at Hugh Fortescue with such fear before she spoke? Miss Marple had learned, through decades of quiet observation, that when something seemed too dramatic to be true, it was often because the real drama lay elsewhere entirely. She watched as they carried the unconscious woman toward the vestry. As the congregation dissolved into excited speculation, as Celia Fortescue clutched her husband's arm with what might have been fear, or might have been relief, exclaimed Mrs. Bantry. I never. No, dear, Miss Marple replied mildly, though I did once know a housemaid in Much Benham who confessed to stealing the silver. But what has that to do with... Perhaps nothing at all, Miss Marple said gently, or perhaps everything. But even as she spoke, her sharp mind was already working, already noting the small inconsistencies, the curious reactions, the pattern that was beginning to emerge from the chaos of the evening. In Miss Marple's experience, a confession was rarely as simple as it appeared. And in a village like St. Mary Mead, where everyone's life touched everyone else's in a dozen invisible ways, the truth was often far more complex and far more interesting than any single dramatic revelation could suggest. The Christmas carol service had ended quite differently than anyone had anticipated. But Miss Marple suspected that the true mystery was only just beginning. The ancient vestry of St. Mary's Church had witnessed countless dramas over its 500 years. Hasty marriages, deathbed confessions, and the endless small comedies of parish life. But never, Miss Marple reflected as she stood quietly in the corner, had it served as the setting for quite so theatrical a collapse. Lavinia Fullerton lay on the narrow oak settle that usually held choir robes, her face still unnaturally pale against the crimson cushion someone had thoughtfully placed beneath her head. Dr. Haydock knelt beside her, his weathered fingers checking her pulse with the practiced efficiency of a man who had attended the village's ailments for 3 decades. "Her heartbeat is regular," he announced to the assembled group. "The fainting spell appears to have been brought on by extreme emotional distress. Not uncommon in cases of—" He paused delicately. Reverend Clement wrung his hands, his kindly face creased with concern and confusion. "But surely we must contact the police, if Miss Fullerton has truly committed murder." "If," Miss Marple murmured, so softly that only Mrs. Bantry, hovering protectively at her elbow, heard her. Mrs. Bantry whispered back, "She confessed right there in front of everyone." "Indeed she did, dear." Miss Marple's blue eyes were thoughtful. Before Mrs. Bantry could respond, Lavinia's eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, her gaze wandered vaguely across the concerned faces surrounding her. The vicar, the doctor, several members of the choir who had rushed to help. Then her eyes focused, and a terrible awareness flooded back into them. "Oh God," she whispered. "You've had a nasty shock, that's what," Dr. Haydock said firmly, assuming she meant the fainting spell rather than the confession. "You need rest and quiet." Lavinia struggled to sit up, her voice sharp with panic. "You don't understand. I meant what I said. Every word." The vestry door opened, admitting a blast of cold air along with Hugh Fortescue. He was a distinguished man in his late 50s, with silver-threaded hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Behind him came his wife Celia, her pretty face pinched with what might have been cold or concern. Fortescue demanded, his barrister's voice cutting through the murmurs. Something flickered across Lavinia's face at his entrance. Fear, recognition, or perhaps relief. Miss Marple, watching from her corner with the stillness of a cat at a mouse hole, caught it all. "Mr. Fortescue," Lavinia said, and her voice trembled. "I should have told you from the beginning. When I came to St. Mary Mead, I thought I could escape my past. But I see now that was foolish." Fortescue's expression was difficult to read. "I don't understand." "No, yes, that is—" Lavinia pressed her hands to her temples. "It's complicated. Arthur Penrose he was my husband." "This is most irregular," Reverend Clement said helplessly. Gerald Barton stood in the doorway, his handsome face alight with curiosity. He had the look of a man watching an entertaining play. "Until the lady changes her mind?" Miss Marple observed how Celia Fortescue's hand tightened on her husband's arm at Barton's voice, and how Marion Fortescue, hovering behind them in the doorway, flinched as though he had struck her. "Mr. Barton is quite right," Hugh Fortescue said, though his tone suggested he disliked agreeing with the younger man. "Whatever the circumstances, a confession of this nature must be reported to the proper authorities." Dr. Haydock protested. Fortescue's voice was crisp, professional. Then, surprisingly, he turned to Lavinia with something approaching gentleness. "Miss Fullerton, as a solicitor, now retired but still familiar with the law, I must advise you that anything you say may be used against you." "How very noble of you, Fortescue," Barton drawled from the doorway. offering legal advice to a confessed murderess. Though I suppose professional courtesy extends even to— "That's quite enough, Mr. Barton," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through his with unexpected authority. Everyone turned to look at her, as though noticing her presence for the first time. "Perhaps we might allow Miss Fullerton some air." "Miss Marple is right," de Haydock said gratefully. "Everyone except the vicar and myself should return to the church." As the others reluctantly filed out, Miss Marple made as if to follow, then paused. Lavinia looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "This Arthur Penrose, your husband. July 15th, 1902. The North Cliff, near the Spa." Lavinia's voice was flat, as though reciting a lesson learned long ago. "We quarrelled. I pushed him. He fell." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How very distressing for you. 22. Thank you, dear." In the church, the remaining congregation buzzed with speculation. Raymond West hurried over to his aunt, his novelist's imagination clearly inflamed by the evening's events. "Aunt Jane, can you believe it? A real murder confession. Right here in St. "Yes, dear." Miss Marple allowed him to guide her to a pew. "Though I couldn't help noticing that Miss Fullerton seemed more frightened than guilty." "Frightened?" Miss Marple settled herself with her handbag in her lap. "But frightened of what, I wonder?" Raymond stared at his aunt. "I didn't say that, dear. I merely observed that fear and guilt, while sometimes companions, are not always the same thing. When you return to London after Christmas, could you possibly visit the newspaper archives? I should like to know everything that was reported about Arthur Penrose's death in Scarborough in July 1902. Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. The drawing room at Gossington Hall possessed the comfortable shabbiness that comes from generations of use rather than neglect. Colonel Bantry stood before the fireplace, poker in hand, attempting to coax more warmth from the coal fire, while his wife presided over the tea tray with the air of a woman conducting a very important tribunal. Miss Marple sat in her customary chair by the window, where the weak winter sunlight provided excellent illumination for her knitting. 2 days had passed since the extraordinary events of Christmas Eve, and the village could speak of little else. "The police have taken her to Much Benham," Mrs. Bantry announced, dispensing tea with vigorous efficiency, "and questioned her for 3 hours. Mrs. Price saw them leaving, said Miss Fullerton looked quite composed, if you please." "Technically, Dolly, she hasn't been arrested," Colonel Bantry corrected, abandoning his poker with a grunt. "Taken in for questioning, that's all." "A distinction without a difference, surely," Raymond West interjected from his position near the bookshelf. He had delayed his return to London at his aunt's request, much to his wife Joyce's bewilderment. "The woman confessed publicly." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily. "Evidence, I should imagine. A confession's one thing, but the authorities will need to verify the facts." Mrs. Bantry protested. "Indeed she did, dear." Miss Marple paused to count her stitches. "I couldn't help wondering, though, about the timing of her confession. Why Christmas Eve?" Joyce West suggested tentatively. She was a practical young woman who found her aunt-in-law's methods somewhat baffling. Possibly, or perhaps she saw someone she recognized. Colonel Bantry harumphed. "I'm suggesting nothing at all, Colonel." Her needles resumed their rhythm. "I did happen to notice that Miss Fullerton seemed quite transfixed by Hugh Fortescue before she made her confession." Raymond leaned forward with interest. "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, that there are several curious connections in this matter that deserve examination. For instance, did you know that Mr. Fortescue practiced law in Yorkshire before he retired to St. Mary Mead? The room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire and the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Bantry set down her teacup with a clatter. "I'm suggesting nothing, Dolly, but I do find coincidences interesting." Colonel Bantry frowned. "Plain girl, quiet." "Yes, and she was observed yesterday afternoon having what appeared to be a heated discussion with Gerald Barton outside the post office. Mrs. Hartnell happened to mention it when I saw her at the chemist's." Raymond pulled out his notebook, a gesture that always preceded his most intense investigative moods. Miss Marple regarded her nephew with mild eyes. "I'm thinking that when a woman of Miss Fullerton's evident refinement and education chooses to confess to a murder committed 23 years ago in front of 60 witnesses on Christmas Eve during a carol service, well, there must be a very compelling reason." The drawing-room door opened to admit Miss Hartnell herself. Her weathered face flushed with cold and excitement. She was a forceful woman who collected information the way others collected stamps, and she burst in without ceremony. She demanded breathlessly. Mrs. Bantry straightened in her chair. "She's left, packed her bags yesterday evening and took the morning train to London. Told Mrs. Briggs, their housekeeper, you know, that she needed to visit her sister, but Mrs. Briggs says she has no sister." This intelligence created a gratifying stir among the assembled company. Joyce West's practical nature was shocked. Miss Hartnell added triumphantly, "The two of them, gone without so much as a word to Mr. Fortescue. He was out seeing Dr. Haydock about his rheumatism, and when he came home, he found a note on the hall table. Miss Marple's needles had stopped moving. Did Miss Hartnell had the grace to look slightly abashed. Well, she may have glanced at it. Just a glance, you understand. It said, 'We cannot stay. You must know why.'" "Good Lord," Colonel Bantry muttered. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her expression was deeply thoughtful. "Could you possibly visit the Fortescue house? Perhaps offer your condolences or some such thing? I should very much like to know Mr. Fortescue's state of mind." Raymond asked. "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that we are looking at a pattern. Like a knitting pattern, you see. Each stitch seems random and purposeless by itself, but when you step back and view the whole, a picture emerges." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "That, my dear Dolly, is precisely what we need to discover." Miss Marple's smile was sad and knowing. "To protect someone, perhaps, or to expose someone. In my experience, when a woman sacrifices her reputation and her freedom, it's usually for one of those two reasons. The question we must answer is, which is it?" She resumed her knitting with renewed purpose, and the others watched her in silence, each contemplating the mystery that had transformed their quiet Christmas into something far more complex and dangerous than any of them had imagined. The reading room of Much Benham Public Library possessed the particular hush that comes from books and learning, a silence broken only by the occasional rustle of turning pages and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Miss Marple sat at one of the heavy oak tables, a stack of old newspapers before her, while her nephew Raymond stood by the reference desk, engaged in quiet conversation with the head librarian. It had taken some persuasion to gain access to the archived newspapers from 1902, but Raymond's status as a published author and Miss Marple's gentle persistence had eventually won the day. Now, with her reading glasses perched on her nose, She methodically worked through the Scarborough Mercury's issues from July of that year. "Here," she murmured, her finger pausing on a column midway down page 3. Raymond hurried over, notebook at the ready. Miss Marple read aloud in her soft, clear voice. "Tragedy at Northcliffe. The body of Mr. Arthur Penrose, aged 28 of Leeds, was recovered yesterday from the waters below the spa. Mr. Penrose had been reported missing by his wife of 6 months, Mrs. Lavinia Penrose, who stated that her husband had gone for an evening walk 3 days prior and failed to return. The coroner has recorded a verdict of accidental death, noting that Mr. Penrose had consumed wine with his dinner and may have lost his footing on the cliff path in the darkness. Mrs. Accidental death, Raymond said thoughtfully. Miss Marple continued reading. But here's something interesting in the following week's edition. Generous bequest. The late Mr. Arthur Penrose has left his entire estate, valued at approximately £3,000, to his widow, Mrs. Lavinia Penrose. Friends of the deceased expressed surprise at this arrangement, as Mr. £3,000 in 1902, Raymond calculated quickly. That would be worth considerably more today. Miss Marple removed her glasses and polished them thoughtfully. And yet she chose to become a music teacher, living modestly in various situations. The library door opened with a soft creak, admitting a blast of cold air and a figure muffled in a dark coat. Miss Marple glanced up, then stiffened slightly with interest. It was Marion Fortescue. The young woman looked haggard, her plain features made plainer by obvious distress. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled as she unwound her scarf. She moved toward the fiction section with the automatic movements of someone seeking refuge in familiar surroundings, then stopped abruptly as she recognized Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect, that is, I thought you would be in St." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, non-threatening. Raymond and I were doing a bit of research. But Marion's gaze had fallen on the newspapers spread across the table, and what little color remained in her face drained away completely. It was a statement, not a question, and Miss Marple saw no point in denying it. "I confess to some curiosity about the matter. Won't you sit down, my dear?" Marion sank into a chair, as though her legs would no longer support her. For a long moment, she stared at her hands, twisting them in her lap in a gesture that reminded Miss Marple powerfully of Christmas Eve in the church. "I should have known someone would look into it," Marion said finally. Miss Marple asked quietly. Marion's laugh was bitter and short. "Guilty? Of course she's guilty." Raymond leaned forward, his novelist's instincts fully engaged. "I mean," Marion stopped, pressing her hands to her face. When she lowered them, her eyes were wet with unshed tears. "I mean that Miss Fullerton is protecting someone who doesn't deserve protection. Someone who has caused nothing but pain and ruin and—" She broke off with a choked sob. Miss Marple reached across the table and gently took the girl's cold hand in her own warm one. "Marion, dear, I think you need to tell us what you know." For a moment, Marion wavered. Then, as though a dam had broken, the words came tumbling out. "Miss Fullerton came to St. Mary Mead 3 months ago because of me. Because I wrote to her. I found her name in some old papers of Father's. Legal documents from a case he handled years ago in Yorkshire. The Penrose case." She was listed as a witness, and there were letters, correspondence between her and Father's firm. Miss Marple asked, "Accusations?" Marian's voice dropped even lower. Miss Fullerton claimed that Arthur Penrose's death wasn't an accident. She said he was murdered, but she also said she wasn't the one who killed him, that she knew who did, but couldn't prove it. She begged Father's firm to investigate further, but they refused. Raymond and Miss Marple exchanged glances. Raymond asked. Marian's face crumpled. "Because of Gerald Barton. Because I hoped that if I could understand what happened 23 years ago, I might understand what was happening now. You see, Miss Fullerton's letters mentioned another person who was there in Scarborough that summer. A young man who had attached himself to the Penroses. A charming young man with no money and expensive taste." The silence in the library was absolute. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but her eyes were sharp as flint. "Not Gerald Barton exactly. Gerald Barton Webb. He dropped the web some time after he came into his inheritance 10 years ago. But yes, he was there, and according to Miss Fullerton's letters, she believed he was the one who pushed Arthur Penrose from the cliff. She believed it then, and I think—" Marian's voice broke. "I think she still believes it now," Raymond demanded. Marian lifted her tear-stained face. "Because he has something on her, some hold over her. And because—" she swallowed hard, "because he threatened to destroy my stepmother if Miss Fullerton ever revealed the truth. You see, Gerald has been blackmailing Celia for months. I don't know what secret he holds over her, but it's something terrible. Something that would ruin her completely." Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes, Gerald went to see her on Christmas Day. I don't know what he said, but she was terrified afterward. She begged me to come with her. Said we had to get away before—" Marian stopped, shaking her head. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind working rapidly through this new information, fitting it into the pattern she had begun to perceive. "Marian, I need you to tell me one more thing." Marian's expression was bleak. I think she was hoping he would help her. You see, Father was the solicitor who handled Arthur Penrose's estate. He knew all the details of the case, all the suspicions, everything. I think Miss Fullerton thought that if she confessed publicly, Father would be forced to reveal what he knew about Gerald's involvement. But Father— Her voice hardened. Marian stood abruptly. "That's something you'll have to discover for yourself, Miss Marple. I've already said too much. But I'll tell you this, whatever Miss Fullerton confessed to on Christmas Eve, the real crime is still hidden." She gathered her coat and scarf with trembling hands and hurried toward the door, leaving Miss Marple and Raymond staring after her in troubled silence. Hugh Fortescue's study was a room that spoke eloquently of its owner's character. Ordered, prosperous, and quietly intimidating. Leather-bound law books lined the walls, their gilt titles catching the lamplight, while the massive mahogany desk dominated the space like a judge's bench. Outside, the winter afternoon was fading into premature darkness, and rain had begun to spatter against the windows with insistent fingers. Miss Marple sat in the visitor's chair, her hands folded primly over her handbag, while Raymond stood near the bookshelf, ostensibly examining a volume on property law. They had been admitted by Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, who had shown them in with the weary air of a woman whose household had fallen into incomprehensible chaos. Fortescue himself sat behind his desk, and Miss Marple observed with interest that he had aged considerably in the past 3 days. His face was grey, his eyes red-rimmed, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of neglect, his collar slightly askew, his tie loosened. "I confess I'm surprised by your visit, Miss Marple," he said, his barrister's voice lacking its customary authority. "I'm not here to gossip, Mr. Fortescue," Miss Marple replied gently. "I'm here because I believe you may be able to help clarify certain aspects of Miss Fullerton's confession." Fortescue's jaw tightened. "I know nothing about that woman's confession beyond what everyone heard in church. I never met her before she came to sin. But you knew of her, didn't you?" The silence that followed was profound. Fortescue's hands, resting on the desk, slowly clenched into fists. "How did you—" He stopped, taking a visible breath. "That was 23 years ago. A routine matter, a young man's accidental death, and the settling of his small estate." Miss Marple's tone remained mild, but her eyes were steady on his face. "Yet Miss Fullerton, then Mrs. Penrose, wrote repeatedly to your firm, claiming that her husband's death was murder, not accident. She begged for an investigation." Fortescue stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to them. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been regret, or might have been fear. "Because she had no evidence, because the coroner's verdict was final, because—" He turned suddenly. "Because she would have destroyed herself with such accusations. She was a young widow, recently bereaved, who had inherited a substantial sum. Had she claimed murder, she herself would have been the primary suspect." "How merciful of you," Raymond said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "It was merciful," Fortescue snapped. "The woman was clearly consumed by guilt. Survivor's guilt, as we would call it now. She felt responsible for her husband's death because they had quarreled before he fell. Such feelings are common in cases of sudden loss." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And yet she never believed it was guilt she felt. She believed it was knowledge." Miss Marple's voice was still gentle, but there was steel beneath the softness. "Mr. Fortescue, I wonder if you would be so kind as to tell me about Gerald Barton." The colour drained from Fortescue's face so completely that Raymond took an involuntary step forward, fearing the man might collapse. But Fortescue remained standing, his hand braced against the window frame, his breathing shallow. "You've been thorough," he said finally. "I have a natural curiosity about human nature," Miss Marple replied, "and I find that the patterns of behaviour often repeat themselves. A young man with expensive tastes and no money, attaching himself to a wealthier couple. The wealthy husband dies conveniently, leaving a substantial inheritance. The young man disappears from the scene. Years later, the same young man reappears in a quiet village, once again involving himself with a family of means." Fortescue returned to his desk and sank into his chair as though his legs would no longer support him. For a long moment he stared at his hands, and when he looked up, his face was haggard. "You want the truth? Very well. Yes, Gerald Barton Webb was in Scarborough that summer. He had befriended Arthur Penrose at their club in Leeds. Gerald has always had a talent for friendship with wealthy men. He visited the Penroses several times during their honeymoon holiday. But you didn't investigate her claims, Raymond said. Fortescue's voice cracked. The room fell silent except for the rain beating against the windows and the ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. I was a young solicitor, newly qualified, handling Penrose's legal affairs. I had travelled to Scarborough to have him sign some documents. I arrived the evening of his death. I saw... He stopped, swallowed hard. I saw Gerald on the cliff path that night. I saw him walking away from the direction of the spa, and there was something in his manner, something furtive and wrong. When news of Penrose's death reached me the next morning, I knew, Raymond demanded, because Gerald saw me too. Because that same evening he came to my hotel room and made it very clear that if I said anything about seeing him on the cliff, he would claim that I was the one on the cliff path, that I was the one with motive. Arthur owed my firm a substantial sum in fees, you see, and as his solicitor, I would benefit from his death. It would have been his word against mine, and he was far more charming, far more believable than I. Miss Marple's expression was sad but unsurprised. I remained silent, and I have paid for that silence every day since. When Gerald reappeared in St. Mary Mead last year, using just Barton as his name, I recognized him immediately. He knew I recognized him. Miss Marple asked. He involved himself with your daughter, then with your wife. Fortescue's face twisted with anguish. Celia's first marriage, before she met me, was not legally dissolved. Her first husband was a drunkard who disappeared into the slums of London 15 years ago, and she believed him dead. But he wasn't dead. Gerald found him somehow, tracked him down. Miss Marple prompted gently. She must have. Gerald has been courting her recently. Oh, not openly, but I've seen them talking after church. She's an attractive woman with an inheritance. He must have let something slip, and she realized he was the same Gerald from Scarborough. Raymond shook his head in amazement. And to protect the woman he was victimizing, Miss Marple added. How very noble. Fortescue looked up at her with desperate eyes. What will you do with this information, Miss Marple? If you go to the police, my silence all these years makes me complicit. My career, my reputation, everything I've built. What you should have told the police 23 years ago, Miss Marple said firmly, is what you must tell them now. Truth delayed is not truth denied, Mr. Fortescue. She rose to her feet with quiet dignity. You have until tomorrow morning to decide whether to come forward voluntarily. After that, I'm afraid I shall have to speak to Inspector Slack myself. Gerald will deny everything, Fortescue said hopelessly. Perhaps. But with your testimony, and Miss Fullerton's, and whatever other evidence can be gathered, I suspect the truth will finally emerge. Good evening, Mr. As they walked through the rain toward home, Raymond glanced at his aunt with admiration. Nonsense, dear. I simply asked questions. Miss Marple paused, looking back at the house where lamplight glowed in the study window. I think he's a man who has lived with guilt for 23 years. Yes, Raymond. The Blue Boar Inn stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, a rambling establishment that had served travellers and locals alike since the days of coaching inns and highwaymen. Its low-ceilinged public bar smelled of tobacco smoke, spilled ale, and the damp wool of winter coats. It was not the sort of place where Miss Marple would ordinarily be found, but desperate times, as she was fond of observing, called for unconventional measures. She sat in a shadowed corner of the lounge bar, a glass of untouched sherry before her, her knitting bag providing the perfect disguise for a woman engaged in nothing more sinister than waiting for a friend. Raymond occupied the next table, ostensibly absorbed in his newspaper, but watching the door with barely concealed intensity. They had been waiting for 20 minutes when Gerald Barton finally arrived. He entered with the careless confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, shaking rain from his coat and running a hand through his dark hair. He was handsome in the manner of men who have learned to use their looks as currency. Charming smile, easy manner, expensively tailored clothes that almost disguised their age. "Whiskey," he called to the bartender. "A double." Miss Marple watched as he collected his drink and surveyed the room with the practiced eye of a predator assessing territory. His gaze passed over her without interest. An elderly lady with her knitting was beneath his notice, and settled instead on a corner table where two businessmen were engaged in animated conversation. But before he could move toward them, the door opened again, admitting Inspector Slack of the Much Benham Police. The change in Barton's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The easy confidence faltered for just a moment, replaced by something harder and more watchful. He took a long drink of his whiskey, then turned to face the inspector with a practiced smile. "Inspector Slack, this is unexpected." Slack was a heavy-set man with a perpetually suspicious expression and a tendency to overlook subtlety in favor of obvious conclusions. He had been a thorn in Miss Marple's side during previous investigations, but even he possessed a certain dogged persistence that occasionally bore fruit. "Official capacity, Mr. Barton?" "Of course." Barton's voice was light, but Miss Marple saw his hand tighten around his glass. "It's regarding Miss Lavinia Fullerton and her confession on Christmas Eve." "Barely. We spoke after church occasionally. She seemed a pleasant enough woman, if rather intense." Slack pulled out his notebook with ponderous ceremony. The silence that followed was electric. Barton's face went carefully blank, then arranged itself into an expression of bemused confusion. 1902? Good Lord, Inspector, that's 23 years ago. I was barely out of school. Let me refresh your memory. That was the evening Arthur Penrose died in Scarborough. You were there, Mr. Barton? Or should I say, Mr. Barton set down his glass with exaggerated care. No, that's strange, because I've just spent the morning reviewing statements taken at the time, including one from a hotel porter who clearly remembers a young gentleman named Gerald Barton Webb, who stayed at the Grand Hotel that week. The porter is mistaken, or his memory is faulty. Perhaps, but Mr. Slack's voice carried a note of satisfaction. He came to see me this morning, made a full statement about seeing you on the cliff path the night Arthur Penrose died, about your threats to implicate him if he spoke, about your reappearance here in St. Mary Mead, and your subsequent blackmail of Mrs. Barton's facade cracked like ice over thin water. His handsome face twisted with fury, and for a moment Miss Marple saw the real man beneath the charming mask, calculating, ruthless, and dangerous. Fortescue is lying. He's trying to shift blame for his own cowardice. He was the one with motive to kill Penrose. The man owed him money. I was merely a guest, a friend. If he saw me on the cliff path, so what? I went for a walk. Perhaps not by itself, Slack admitted. Raymond chose that moment to lower his newspaper. Especially when one considers your recent activities, Mr. Barton. The blackmail attempts, the threats to expose Mrs. Fortescue's legal situation. Barton's eyes narrowed as he recognized Raymond. The nephew, of course. Mr. West is a respected author, Slack said stiffly, and he's been assisting with inquiries. Now, Mr. Barton's voice was soft, dangerous. You have no evidence beyond the word of a confessed murderess, and a man who admits he's been silent about a supposed crime for 23 years. Perhaps not for Arthur Penrose's death, Miss Marple said quietly, rising from her corner table. The passage of time does make that prosecution difficult. But blackmail, Mr. Barton, is a crime that occurred quite recently. And Mrs. Barton spun to face her, and the hatred in his eyes was startling in its intensity. You meddling old woman! Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the gentle tones. You see, Mr. Barton, I've spent my life observing human nature, and I've learned that men like you operate on the assumption that others are too frightened, too ashamed, or too civilized to expose you. But eventually, someone finds the courage to speak. Barton's smile was ugly. And what makes you think anyone will believe your theories, Miss Marple? Inspector Slack believes me, Miss Marple replied. As does Mr. Fortescue, who has provided a detailed statement. As does Miss Fullerton, who is even now recanting her false confession and providing testimony about what she actually witnessed in Scarborough. Barton looked from Miss Marple to Inspector Slack to Raymond, and something shifted in his expression. The calculation of a gambler who has finally realized the game is lost. You think you've won, he said softly. But even if everything you claim is true, Penrose's death was 23 years ago. The statute of limitations does not apply to murder in English law, Miss Marple interrupted gently, as I'm sure you know. And while proving murder after so many years may be difficult, I suspect the charge of blackmail will be quite sufficient to ensure you face justice. Slack stepped forward, and for a moment Miss Marple thought Barton might bolt. But then his shoulders sagged, and the charm that had been his greatest weapon finally deserted him entirely. Very well, he said, his voice bitter. But I'll tell you this. Arthur Penrose was a fool who deserved what he got. He flaunted his wealth, lorded it over everyone, treated his wife abominably. All I did was give him a small push when he was already teetering at the cliff's edge. If that makes me a murderer, then so be it. No, Miss Marple agreed quietly. Guilt is rarely singular in these matters, but accepting responsibility for one's actions, that Mr. As Inspector Slack led Barton away, Raymond joined his aunt, shaking his head in admiration. I didn't know, dear, but I suspected that his pride would be his undoing. Men like Mr. Barton cannot bear to be thought cowards or fools. She gathered her knitting bag with a small sigh. Though I confess, I take no pleasure in it. We'll be freed, I should think. Miss Marple moved toward the door, then paused. They stepped out into the rainy night. and Miss Marple turned her face toward home, toward the peaceful routine of village life that would soon resume its accustomed rhythms. But first, there were still truths to be spoken, and consequences to be faced. The police station at Much Benham was a stolid Victorian building that smelled of floor polish, damp wool, and the peculiar institutional odour of bureaucracy. Miss Marple sat on an uncomfortable wooden bench in the corridor outside Inspector Slack's office, her hands folded peacefully over her handbag, while behind the closed door, voices rose and fell in urgent conversation. She had been waiting for nearly an hour when the door finally opened to reveal Lavinia Fullerton, accompanied by a severe-looking woman in a solicitor's dark suit. Miss Fullerton looked profoundly exhausted, her face pale and drawn, but there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, a quality that might have been relief or might have been simple resignation. "Miss Marple," she said, and her voice trembled slightly. "Inspector Slack said you were waiting." Miss Marple rose with her customary grace. "I merely asked a few questions." Lavinia's eyes filled with tears. "I've been such a fool, such a terrible, cowardly fool. For 23 years, I've lived with the knowledge of what Gerald did, and I said nothing. I told myself I had no proof, that no one would believe me, that speaking out would only bring more pain." The solicitor touched her client's arm gently. "Miss Fullerton, I really must advise you not to discuss—" "It's all right, Miss Pemberton." Lavinia sank onto the bench, and Miss Marple resumed her seat beside her. "Arthur wasn't a kind husband. Our marriage was difficult. He had a violent temper, and he drank too much. That evening in Scarborough, we quarrelled terribly. He struck me, and I fled back to our lodgings." Miss Marple said nothing, merely waited with the patient stillness that invited confidences. "Gerald had been attentive to me throughout our stay in Scarborough. Too attentive. I was young and unhappy, and I'm ashamed to say I encouraged his attention. Not consciously, perhaps, but enough that Arthur had noticed and become jealous." Miss Marple prompted gently. "He said Arthur had fallen from the cliff. He said it so calmly, as though he were reporting the weather. I knew immediately what had happened. I saw it in his eyes, that satisfaction, that cold triumph. He had followed Arthur after our quarrel. He had found him alone on the cliff path, probably still in a rage, and he had—" She stopped, pressing her hands to her face. "He pushed him, Miss Marple. I know he did. I remained silent, and I inherited Arthur's money, and I lived with the guilt of that silence every day. When I saw Gerald again here in St. Mary Mead, courting poor Marion Fortescue, and then turning his attention to Mrs. Fortescue, I knew I had to act. But I was still too frightened to tell the simple truth." She looked at Miss Marple with red-rimmed eyes. "You did. You were trying to protect Mrs. Fortescue from Gerald's blackmail while simultaneously exposing his guilt," Miss Marple said. "It was a brave thing to do, if somewhat misguided. Though I must say, I'm curious. Why did you look at Mr. Lavinia's expression became complicated?" "Because I recognized him. Not from Scarborough. I never met him there, though I knew he was Arthur's solicitor. But from the letters I wrote to his firm afterward, begging for help, begging for someone to investigate Gerald. He refused me. He told me to accept the verdict and move on. and when I saw him in the church that evening, I realized he must have known. He must have known about Gerald, must have had his own reasons for keeping silent. Which, in the end, it did, Miss Marple observed. The door to Inspector Slack's office opened again, and the inspector himself emerged, looking simultaneously satisfied and exhausted. Behind him came Hugh Fortescue, his face grey, but somehow more peaceful than it had been in days. Fortescue stopped when he saw Lavinia, and for a long moment the two regarded each other in silence. Two people bound together by guilt and silence and the weight of years. Miss Fullerton, Fortescue said finally, his voice rough with emotion. I owe you an apology that no words can adequately express. 23 years ago, I failed you. I chose my career, my reputation over justice. We both made choices, Mr. Fortescue, Lavinia replied quietly. Mine to remain silent about Gerald's crime. Yours to protect yourself instead of seeking truth. I cannot forgive myself. Perhaps not, but I want you to know that I have told Inspector Slack everything. Every detail of what I saw that night in Scarborough. Every threat Gerald made. Every suspicion I harbored. Whatever comes of it, I will face it. Inspector Slack cleared his throat importantly. Yes, well, thanks to Mr. Fortescue's statement, combined with Miss Fullerton's testimony and Mr. Barton's own rather remarkable confession at the Blue Boar, we have sufficient evidence to charge him with the murder of Arthur Penrose, as well as multiple counts of blackmail. The Crown Prosecution Service will have to determine whether the murder charge can proceed after so many years, but the blackmail charges alone should ensure Miss Marple asked. Is free to go. Her false confession was made under duress. Emotional duress caused by Mr. Barton's blackmail of Mrs. Fortescue. We see no purpose in charging her with making a false statement. Lavinia stood slowly, as though her legs were uncertain they would support her. What will happen to Celia? Fortescue's expression softened slightly. They will come home, I hope. Celia's first husband has been located, and has agreed for a sum to provide documentation that their marriage effectively ended through abandonment years ago. Our marriage may need to be formalized again to satisfy legal requirements, but there will be no scandal, no exposure. Marian knows the truth now, and she has forgiven her stepmother. Lavinia asked quietly. We'll face justice at last, Miss Marple said firmly. Delayed, but not denied. As they emerged from the police station into the cold afternoon air, Raymond was waiting by his motor car, collar turned up against the wind. He helped his aunt into the passenger seat, then turned to Lavinia. May we drive you somewhere, Miss Fullerton? Back to St. Lavinia shook her head. Thank you, but no. I think I shall return to Surrey, to my family. I've been away too long, hiding from a past that could never truly be escaped. A wise decision, Miss Marple said warmly, though I hope you won't think too harshly of St. Mary Mead. That drew a small, genuine smile from Lavinia. I shall remember the kindness I found here more than the drama, Miss Marple. Your kindness especially. I simply observed what was in front of me, dear. You are a good woman who made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. After Lavinia had departed in a taxi, Raymond started the motor car and began the drive back to St. Mary Mead. For several minutes they drove in silence, the winter landscape passing by in shades of grey and brown. "You know," Raymond said finally, "I thought I understood human nature reasonably well. I'm a novelist, after all." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "That's because life is always more complex than fiction, dear. In fiction, motives must be clear and consequences must follow logically. But in life, people act from mixed motives, and consequences often arrive decades late. We are all of us," she added softly, "carrying secrets and making compromises. And do you think they will?" "I think they have begun to," Miss Marple replied. The old vicarage tea room occupied a converted morning room that overlooked St. Mary Mead's winter garden, where frost still clung stubbornly to the bare branches despite the weak afternoon sun. Miss Marple had suggested the meeting place, knowing that the neutral, genteel atmosphere might ease what promised to be a difficult conversation. Celia Fortescue sat across from her, a delicate china teacup trembling slightly in her hands. She had returned to St. Mary Mead that morning, though without Marian, who had chosen to remain in London for a few more days. The young woman was beautiful in the fragile way of hothouse flowers, all pale skin and large eyes and nervous grace. And she looked as though a strong wind might shatter her entirely. "You must think me terribly weak," Celia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Running away like that." "I think," Miss Marple replied gently, pouring tea with steady hands, "that you were frightened. Fear makes us all do things we might not otherwise do." Celia's laugh was bitter. "I've built my entire life on deception, Miss Marple. My marriage to Hugh isn't even legal. I'm a bigamist, though I never meant to be. When James, my first husband, disappeared into drink and poverty, I waited 5 years before I presumed him dead. I met Hugh, and he was so kind, so decent. I thought I deserved a second chance at happiness." Miss Marple selected a biscuit with careful precision. Celia set down her teacup before she could drop it. "How did he find out? That's what I keep asking myself." "Men like Mr. Barton make it their business to discover secrets," Miss Marple said. "They have a talent for finding the weak points in people's armor. A word overheard here, a document glimpsed there, a connection made between disparate pieces of information. Once they have your secret, they own you." Celia's voice broke. "For 6 months, he's been bleeding me dry. Small amounts at first, £20 here, 30 there. He said it was only temporary, that he needed help with some investments. But then the amounts grew larger, and the requests more frequent." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Hugh is generous to a fault. He gave me control of the household accounts, said I should spend what I needed to maintain our home properly. I used that trust to pay Gerald, and every payment felt like another betrayal. I was stealing from my husband to protect a lie, and the worst part," her voice dropped even lower, "the worst part was that I began to hate Hugh for his very kindness. If he had been suspicious, if he had questioned me, it might have forced the truth out sooner." The tea-room door chimed, admitting Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock, engaged in animated conversation about the recent events. They spotted Miss Marple and approached with the friendly presumption of long acquaintance. "Jane! Mrs. Bantry's exuberance faltered slightly as she registered the tense atmosphere. "Not at all, Dolly," Miss Marple said warmly. "We were just discussing the unfortunate business with Mr. Barton. Mrs. Dr. Haydock pulled up a chair, his weathered face kind beneath his bristling eyebrows. "If I may say so, Mrs. Fortescue, you've been through a terrible ordeal. How are you managing?" "You're very kind, Doctor, but I don't think I deserve kindness." "What you've done," Dr. Haydock said firmly, "is survive an impossible situation with as much grace as possible. Barton is a predator who exploited your vulnerability. But my marriage to Hugh can be rectified," Miss Marple interjected quietly. "I understand that Mr. Fortescue has already begun proceedings to resolve the legal complications." Celia's smile was wan. For £500, James would cooperate with Satan himself. Hugh paid him to sign documents attesting to the dissolution of our marriage by abandonment. We'll need to remarry quietly, but at least there will be no scandal, no public exposure. Hugh has been so good about it all. Too good. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," Miss Marple observed. "It's about love and understanding. Your husband loves you, Mrs. Fortescue. Mrs. Bantry, never one for prolonged solemnity, seized on a different thread. What I want to know is how you figured it all out, Jane. All those connections between Scarborough and Gerald and Miss Fullerton." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. "It was simply a matter of observation, dear. When Miss Fullerton made her confession, I noticed several things that didn't quite fit. Her terror when she looked at Mr. Fortescue suggested she expected help from him, not that she feared him." Dr. Haydock asked. "I didn't, not at first, but Raymond was kind enough to research the newspaper archives, and once we discovered that Arthur Penrose's death had been ruled accidental despite Mrs. Penrose's protests, the pattern became clearer. A young widow claiming murder when the official verdict was accident. That suggested someone else was involved, someone she couldn't prove guilty. And when we discovered Gerald Barton had been there at the time, under a slightly different name, well, you put 2 and 2 together and made 4, Mrs. Bantry finished triumphantly. "I simply recognized a pattern," Miss Marple said modestly. "Gerald Barton attached himself to wealthy people, exploited their weaknesses, and disappeared before consequences could catch him. He did it in Scarborough with the Penroses, and he was attempting to do it here with the Fortescues." Celia had been listening with an expression of growing wonder. "You make it sound so simple, but you saved my life, Miss Marple. Truly. If Gerald had continued his blackmail much longer, I think I might have—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I was becoming desperate. I'd begun to think there was no way out except to remove yourself from the situation entirely," Miss Marple finished gently. "Yes, my dear, I suspected as much. That's why I felt it necessary to act quickly." Dr. Haydock's expression grew stern. "The man is a monster. 23 years of freedom after committing murder, and he spent that time preying on vulnerable women?" Celia asked anxiously. "The murder was so long ago." "Then he'll face justice for the blackmail," Miss Marple said firmly. "And for that crime, at least, we have abundant recent evidence. Your testimony, Mrs. Fortescue, combined with the records of money withdrawn from your accounts and Miss Fullerton's observations, should be more than sufficient." Celia's eyes filled with tears. "Marion won't speak to me. She came to London because I begged her, but she's so angry. She says I should have told Hugh the truth from the beginning, that secrets always cause more harm than honesty. And she's right. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, or perhaps Gerald would have found another weakness to exploit. Men like him always do. But dwelling on what might have been is rather pointless, don't you think? I don't know, Celia admitted. Then you rebuild, Miss Marple said simply. You begin again, this time with honesty as your foundation instead of fear. Your husband loves you. Your stepdaughter will come to understand and forgive in time. And you have the opportunity to create something genuine from the ashes of deception. Celia reached across the table and grasped Miss Marple's hand. I'm not wise, dear. I'm simply old, and I've watched people make mistakes, including my own mistakes, for many years. The lending library in Much Benham was Marion Fortescue's domain, a realm of ordered shelves and hushed voices where she had always felt most herself. The smell of old paper and leather bindings provided a comfort that human company rarely did, and the predictable routines of cataloguing and shelving offered refuge from the chaos that had consumed her life. Miss Marple found her there on a grey January afternoon, seated at her desk behind the circulation counter, mechanically stamping return dates into books with the concentration of someone trying very hard not to think. Good afternoon, Marion, dear, Miss Marple said softly, not wishing to startle the girl. Marion looked up, and the ravages of the past week were evident in her face, shadows beneath her eyes, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult thoughts. But she managed a wan smile. Miss Marple, no, you're not disturbing me, not. She gestured to the empty reading room. People are still recovering from Christmas, I suppose. I rather think, Miss Marple said mildly, settling into the chair beside Marion's desk, that the village is gossiping about Gerald Barton's arrest. Marion's voice was flat. How lovely! The poor Fortescues, taken in by a charlatan. The poor daughter, courted by a murderer. The poor wife, revealed as a bigamist. Miss Marple regarded the young woman with compassion. Marion's control cracked suddenly, her voice rising. My father kept silent about a murder for 23 years to protect his career. My stepmother built our entire marriage on a lie. Gerald? She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Gerald courted me, made me believe he cared for me, and all the while he was planning to blackmail Celia. I was just a means to an end, a way to get close to the family. Your anger is entirely justified, Miss Marple said gently. Marion's eyes widened, then filled with tears. Because I've lived long enough to recognize the particular quality of anger that comes from feeling foolish. You prided yourself on your intelligence, your ability to see through people's pretenses. And yet you were deceived by Gerald Barton, just as your stepmother was, just as Miss Fullerton was decades ago. Marion's whisper was barely audible. Last summer, when he first came to St. Mary Mead, he was so charming, so attentive. He listened when I spoke about books and ideas. He made me feel seen in a way I'd never felt before. And I'm so plain, so ordinary. I couldn't believe someone like Gerald would be interested in me. But he was. Miss Marple prompted, and then he met Celia at a garden party, and everything changed. He became distant, found excuses not to see me. I thought perhaps I'd imagined his interest, that I'd been a silly fool building castles in the air. But sometimes I would catch him watching Celia with this expression. Calculating. Predatory. Marian wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. About 2 months ago, I came home unexpectedly one afternoon and heard Celia crying in her room. When I asked what was wrong, she said it was nothing, just a headache. But I saw a letter on her desk, just a glimpse before she covered it, and I recognized Gerald's handwriting. And that's why you searched your father's papers? Yes. I thought perhaps father knew something about Gerald. Something that would explain why Celia was so frightened. Instead, I found the correspondence about the Penrose case. When I read Miss Fullerton's letters describing a charming young man named Gerald who had been present when Arthur Penrose died, I knew. I wrote to her immediately, told her that Gerald Barton was in St. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That must have been a terrible shock for Miss Fullerton. I didn't know what else to do, Marian said miserably. I couldn't tell father. I'd found the letters by snooping through his private papers. I couldn't tell Celia. She was already terrified of something. So I told Miss Fullerton, and I hoped she would know what to do. She was trying to protect your stepmother, Miss Marple explained. She had discovered Gerald's blackmail somehow. Perhaps he boasted to her, thinking she would be sympathetic, not realizing she knew his true nature. It was brave, Marian admitted grudgingly. Foolish, but brave, unlike me. You did more than you realize, dear. Your letter prompted Miss Fullerton to act. Without it, Gerald might have continued his blackmail indefinitely. Marian was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of a book on her desk. I went to see Celia yesterday, in London. I told myself I was going to tell her I couldn't forgive her, that she'd destroyed everything with her lies. But when I saw her, her voice cracked. She looked so small and broken. She kept apologizing, saying she understood if I never wanted to see her again, that she's been more of a mother to me than my own mother ever was. My real mother died when I was 6 and I barely remember her. Celia came into my life when I was 21 and she was kind to me. She listened to me talk about my books and my work. She never tried to replace my mother or force affection. She was just there, steady and gentle and caring. And now I discover that all along she was carrying this terrible secret, this fear that everything could be destroyed at any moment. Very lonely indeed, Miss Marple agreed softly. So I told her I forgave her. I told her I understood why she kept silent, even if I wished she hadn't. And I told her, Marian's voice broke entirely now. I told her that I still considered her my mother, whatever the legal complications might be. Because she is. Miss Marple felt the sting of tears in her own eyes. That was a very generous thing to do, Marian. Was it? I don't feel brave. I feel angry and confused and betrayed and... She laughed shakily. And somehow still hopeful. Not foolish at all, dear. Hope is never foolish. It's what allows us to rebuild after disaster. to trust again after betrayal. Your family has been through a terrible ordeal, but you're still a family." Marion straightened slightly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Father wants us all to sit down together and talk. Really talk, without secrets or evasions. I think I'm ready for that now. I'm still angry at him for his cowardice 23 years ago, but I also understand that people make mistakes, and those mistakes can haunt them for decades. Yes, he has. When you were investigating all of this, uncovering secrets, connecting pieces, did you ever feel that perhaps some secrets should remain hidden?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I think that's a false choice, Marion. Secrets don't remain safely hidden. They fester and spread like infection, poisoning everything they touch. The truth may be painful, but it's also healing. Your family's secrets were destroying you all from the inside. Now that they're exposed, you can begin to heal." Marion nodded slowly. "I suppose you're right. And at least now we know where we stand. No more wondering what people are hiding, what might be revealed next." "More than survived it," Miss Marple said warmly. "You're beginning to rebuild on a foundation of honesty." As Miss Marple left the library, she reflected that Marion Fortescue was stronger than she knew. The girl had been tested by betrayal and disappointment, and she had emerged with her capacity for love and forgiveness intact. That, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The courtroom at the Old Bailey possessed the austere majesty of Victorian justice. High ceilings adorned with ornate plasterwork, dark oak panelling that absorbed light and sound, and an atmosphere heavy with the weight of centuries of verdicts. Miss Marple sat in the public gallery, her hands folded over her handbag, her keen eyes missing nothing as the trial of Gerald Barton entered its third day. Raymond sat beside her, his notebook filled with observations that would undoubtedly find their way into a future novel. Around them, the gallery was packed with spectators drawn by the sensational nature of the case. A murder 23 years old, a Christmas Eve confession, and a web of blackmail spanning decades. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, and the assembly stood as Mr. Justice Weatherby entered, his scarlet robes a splash of colour against the courtroom's sombre tones. The prosecution had spent 2 days meticulously building their case. The blackmail charges were straightforward. Celia Fortescue's testimony had been devastating in its quiet dignity, her bank records providing irrefutable evidence of systematic extortion. But the murder charge was more problematic. 23 years was a long time, and physical evidence had long since disappeared into the sea. Now, as the court settled, the defense barrister rose. Sir Edmund Carstairs was a man who wore his reputation like armour, silver-haired, commanding, and possessed of a voice that could make the most dubious argument sound reasonable. "My lords, members of the jury," he began, his tone suggesting weary patience with a regrettable miscarriage of justice. We have heard much over these past days about events that allegedly occurred in July of 1902. We have heard testimony from witnesses whose memories span more than 2 decades. We have heard accusations based on glimpses and suspicions and the understandable grief of a young widow. But what we have not heard is evidence. He paused, allowing his words to settle over the courtroom like snow. Mr. Hugh Fortescue testified that he saw my client on a cliff path 23 years ago. He saw him walking. That is all. Walking on a public path is not murder. Miss Lavinia Fullerton testified that she believed my client pushed her husband from a cliff. Believed. She did not see it happen. She was not present. In the dock, Gerald Barton sat with an expression of wounded innocence that was almost convincing. He had dressed carefully for the trial, respectable but not ostentatious, his handsome features arranged in lines of patient suffering. Only his eyes, Miss Marple noted, betrayed him. They moved constantly, calculating, assessing, searching for advantage even now. Sir Edmund continued, "As for the charges of blackmail, I do not deny that my client accepted money from Mrs. Fortescue. However, these were loans, freely given by a woman who considered herself his friend. That she now characterizes them as extortion is understandable. Her marriage has been revealed as legally questionable, and she seeks to deflect blame for her own deceptions." Raymond leaned close to his aunt. "He's very good, isn't he?" "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. As if on cue, the prosecution barrister rose. Sir James Thornton was a stark contrast to his opponent. Younger, less polished, but possessed of a fierce intensity that commanded attention. "My learned colleague speaks eloquently of the absence of physical evidence," Sir James began. "And he is quite right. 23 years is a long time. Bodies decay, memories fade, and murderers congratulate themselves on their cleverness. But this court exists precisely because some crimes cannot be measured solely in physical evidence." He turned to face the jury directly. "Let us examine that picture. In the summer of '02, a charming young man with expensive tastes and no income befriended a wealthy couple. Within weeks, the wealthy husband was dead, and the widow inherited £3,000. The charming young man disappeared. 23 years later, the same man, now calling himself simply Gerald Barton, appears in St. Mary Mead. Once again, he involves himself with a family of means. Once again, he exploits their vulnerabilities for financial gain. Is this coincidence?" Sir James's voice rose. "Arthur Penrose died on July the 15th, 1902. The coroner ruled it an accident, and why would he not? A man had fallen from a cliff at night, possibly intoxicated. Such tragedies occur, but Lavinia Penrose knew differently. She knew her husband had quarrelled with her, yes, but she also knew that Gerald Barton Webb had pursued her with an intensity that frightened her." The courtroom was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the barrister. She could not prove what she knew, so she remained silent. And Gerald Barton benefited from that silence for 23 years. But silence, as we have learned, has its limits. When Miss Fullerton discovered that Barton was once again preying on innocent women, she chose to act. Sir James moved toward the witness box, where Hugh Fortescue would soon be recalled. "Mr. Fortescue will testify again," and this time he will explain exactly what he saw on that cliff path. Not merely a man walking, but a man whose clothes were dishevelled, whose manner was furtive, who looked behind him constantly as though fleeing from something or someone. A man who, when confronted the next day about his presence on the cliff, threatened to destroy Sir Edmund was on his feet. "Sustained," Justice Weatherby said mildly. Sir James bowed slightly. "I merely wished to clarify what the evidence will show. And the evidence will show that Gerald Barton is a predator who has spent decades exploiting the vulnerable, blackmailing the desperate, and evading justice for a murder he committed in his youth." As the morning session concluded and the court adjourned for lunch, Miss Marple and Raymond made their way out into the cold January air. The streets around the Old Bailey teemed with barristers in their wigs and gowns, journalists comparing notes, and the general bustle of London's legal district. Raymond asked. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, watching the crowds. "I think the blackmail charges are certain. The evidence there is overwhelming. As for the murder," she paused, "that depends on whether the jury believes that patterns of behavior can constitute proof. Some will say no, that suspicion is not enough." "I believe," Miss Marple said firmly, "that Gerald Barton pushed Arthur Penrose from that cliff. I believe he has escaped justice for far too long." They walked in silence for a moment before Raymond spoke again. "If he's acquitted of the murder charge, then he will still serve substantial time for the blackmail," Miss Marple interrupted. "And perhaps that is enough. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, Raymond." Inside the Old Bailey, Hugh Fortescue waited in the witness room, preparing to give the testimony that would either condemn or free the man who had held him hostage to silence for 23 years. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed his statement, but his resolve was firm. Whatever the outcome, he would speak the complete truth at last. In another room, Lavinia Fullerton sat with Miss Pemberton, her solicitor, going over her own testimony for what felt like the 100th time. She had recanted her false confession, explained her motives, and provided every detail she could remember about that terrible summer in Scarborough. Now she could only wait and hope that the truth, after so many years of burial, would finally be believed. And in the holding cell below the court, Gerald Barton sat alone, his charm finally failing him, his calculations growing increasingly desperate as he realized that the carefully constructed life built on other people's fear and silence was crumbling beyond repair. The trial would continue for 3 more days, with testimony that would reveal depths of manipulation and cruelty that shocked even the jaded observers who frequented the Old Bailey. But its outcome would rest, as all trials must, on 12 ordinary people asked to make an extraordinary judgment about events long past and motivations difficult to prove. Justice, Miss Marple reflected as she and Raymond hailed a taxi, was always an imperfect instrument. But it was the best instrument humanity had devised, and sometimes, just sometimes, it was enough. The jury room deliberations had stretched into their 2nd day, and the waiting had become almost unbearable. Miss Marple sat in the courthouse corridor, her knitting needles clicking with their usual steady rhythm, though anyone who knew her well would have noticed the slight irregularity in her stitches, a telltale sign of inner tension. Hugh Fortescue paced near the tall windows, his face grey with exhaustion. Celia sat on a nearby bench, Marian's hand clasped tightly in her own. Lavinia Fullerton occupied a corner seat, her eyes distant, as though she had retreated to some interior landscape where the verdict could not reach her. Raymond muttered, checking his pocket watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. They've had all the evidence. Reasonable people often disagree about what constitutes reasonable doubt, Miss Marple observed quietly, particularly when the crime is so distant in time. Dr. Haydock, who had come up from St. Mary Mead to support the Fortescues, grunted his agreement. Though the blackmail charges are clear enough. But it won't be enough, Marian said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Not for what he did to Arthur Penrose. Not for the 23 years of fear he imposed on Miss Fullerton and father. Before anyone could answer, the courtroom doors opened and the bailiff emerged. The words sent a ripple of movement through the corridor. People rose, gathering belongings, steeling themselves for whatever was to come. Miss Marple carefully tucked her knitting into her bag and stood with the quiet dignity that was as much a part of her as breathing. The courtroom filled rapidly, spectators jostling for the best seats, journalists sharpening their pencils in anticipation. Gerald Barton was led up from the holding cells, and Miss Marple observed with interest that his composure had finally cracked. His face was pale, his hands unsteady, and his eyes darted around the courtroom with something approaching panic. Justice Weatherby entered, and the assembly rose. When they were seated again, the foreman of the jury, a stolid-looking man in his 50s, stood at the judge's invitation. The clerk of the court stood. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, as though every person held their breath simultaneously. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of reaction through the gallery. Celia pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Hugh Fortescue closed his eyes as though in prayer. Lavinia Fullerton remained perfectly still, but tears began to stream silently down her face. Gerald Barton swayed in the dock, gripping the rail for support. "No," he said, his voice rising. "No, this is wrong. You can't. There was no evidence, nothing but speculation and lies. Mr. Barton, you will remain silent," Justice Weatherby said sternly. The clerk continued. "On the third count." By the time the clerk had finished, Gerald Barton had been found guilty on all charges. He stood in the dock, his charm and confidence stripped away, revealing the frightened, desperate man beneath. Justice Weatherby regarded him with an expression that mingled severity with something that might have been pity. "Gerald Barton, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 1 count of murder and multiple counts of blackmail. These crimes span decades and have caused immeasurable suffering to numerous individuals. The murder of Arthur Penrose was a cowardly act committed for financial gain. Your subsequent blackmail of Mrs. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "The law provides for mercy when circumstances warrant it. However, I find no mitigating circumstances in your case. You have shown no remorse, no recognition of the harm you have caused." Gerald Barton opened his mouth as though to protest, but no words emerged. "For the crime of murder, I sentence you to life imprisonment. For the crimes of blackmail, I impose concurrent sentences of 10 years on each count. You will serve a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole." As the guards moved to escort Barton from the dock, he suddenly turned toward the gallery, his eyes finding Hugh Fortescue. "This is your fault," he spat, his voice venomous. "If you had kept silent as you promised, none of this would have happened." "No, Mr. Barton," Fortescue replied, his voice carrying across the courtroom with unexpected strength. "You destroyed yourself. I merely found the courage belatedly to tell the truth." Barton lunged toward the gallery, but the guards seized him firmly. As he was dragged from the courtroom, his shouts echoing in the high-ceilinged space, Miss Marple reflected that she had rarely seen a more complete collapse of a carefully constructed persona. Outside the Old Bailey, the winter afternoon was cold and clear. Journalists surrounded the participants, shouting questions, but Inspector Slack and several constables formed a protective barrier, allowing the group to reach their waiting motorcars. Lavinia Fullerton stood on the courthouse steps, her face turned toward the pale sun. Miss Marple approached her quietly. Lavinia considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure. Relief, certainly. Vindication, perhaps. But also..." She paused, searching for words. "Also a profound sadness. 23 years, Miss Marple. 23 years during which justice lay dormant while Gerald walked free." "You did insist," Miss Marple reminded her gently. "You wrote to Mr. Fortescue's firm repeatedly. You were refused, dismissed, told to remain silent." "Perhaps, but I could have done more. I could have gone to the newspapers, could have made such a noise that someone would have had to investigate. Instead, I accepted the silence imposed upon me and rebuilt my life on that foundation of unspoken truth." "It makes you human," Miss Marple said firmly. "We all make compromises with conscience, my dear. The question is not whether we make them, but whether we eventually find the courage to face what we've compromised. You did." Hugh Fortescue approached them, Celia and Marion flanking him on either side. He looked older than his years, but somehow more at peace, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Miss Fullerton," he said formally, "I owe you an apology that no words can adequately express. 23 years ago, I failed you. I chose my own interests over justice, and countless people have suffered for that choice." Lavinia studied him for a long moment. "You spoke the truth when it mattered, Mr. Fortescue. You gave testimony that helped convict a murderer. That took courage, especially knowing it would expose your own past illness. I think..." She paused, then extended her hand. "I think we have both carried our guilt long enough." Fortescue took her hand, and the relief in his face was almost painful to witness. "Thank you." Marion stepped forward. "Don't," Lavinia said quickly. "Your letter forced me to act. Without it, Gerald might have continued his blackmail indefinitely, might have destroyed your family completely." As the group began to disperse, preparing for their various journeys home, Miss Marple found herself standing with Raymond, watching the winter sun sink toward the London rooftops. "Another mystery solved," Raymond said with satisfaction. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "though I find myself thinking about all the small choices that led to this moment. Do you think it was worth it?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, watching as Lavinia Fullerton climbed into a taxi, her bearing straighter than it had been in weeks. "I think," she said finally, "that truth is always worth pursuing, even when it arrives late and costs dearly. Because the alternative, living with lies and fear and buried guilt, that costs even more. It costs us our humanity, Raymond." Spring came gently to St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself needed time to heal from the dramatic events of winter. Daffodils pushed through the earth in the vicarage garden, and the ancient cherry tree behind the church burst into clouds of pale pink blossoms. Life, with its eternal insistence on renewal, continued its ancient rhythms. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a mild April afternoon, enjoying the weak sunshine and the industrious buzzing of early bees. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she contemplated the transformation that had occurred in the lives of those touched by Gerald Barton's crimes. The creak of her garden gate announced a visitor. Lavinia Fullerton appeared, carrying a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I've brought some lemon cakes, Mrs. Price's recipe." "How delightful, my dear!" Miss Marple gestured to the chair beside her. Indeed, Lavinia did look well. The haunted expression that had shadowed her features for months had lifted, replaced by something approaching serenity. She wore a simple spring dress in pale green, and her hair was arranged with care. "I'm leaving St. Mary Mead," Lavinia said as she settled into her chair, "at the end of the month." Miss Marple felt a pang of disappointment, but kept her voice mild. "That's rather sudden, isn't it? I had hoped you might stay." Lavinia's smile was bittersweet. "St. Mary Mead will always be the place where I finally told the truth, where I stopped running from the past. That's important to me." "I understand completely, dear. Bath. I've been offered a position teaching music at a girls' school there. It's a good opportunity, and the headmistress seems like a sensible woman. She knows my history. I was completely honest with her, but she judged me on my qualifications rather than my past." Miss Marple reached over and patted Lavinia's hand. "You deserve nothing less. You're a woman of courage and integrity who was placed in an impossible situation. Not everyone in the village agrees. Mrs. Hartnell still gives me rather cold looks at the post office." "Miss Weatherby," Miss Marple said with uncharacteristic tartness, "has the misfortune of having lived a very comfortable life with no experience of difficult moral choices. It's easy to judge when one has never been tested." They were interrupted by the arrival of Marion Fortescue, who came through the gate with an armful of books from the lending library. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding. I saw Miss Fullerton come in and thought—" She stopped, suddenly shy. Lavinia rose and embraced the younger woman warmly. "I was hoping I'd see you before I left." As Marion settled herself on the garden bench, Miss Marple quietly excused herself to prepare tea. understanding that the two women needed time alone together. In the kitchen, as she arranged cups and saucers on a tray, she could hear the murmur of voices from the garden. Earnest, emotional, healing. When she returned with the tea things, both women had tears on their faces. But they were the good kind of tears. The kind that came from genuine connection and mutual understanding. Marion has been telling me about the family situation, Lavinia explained as Miss Marple poured. They are, Marion confirmed, accepting her teacup. Father and Celia had their marriage properly formalized last month. It was a quiet ceremony at the registry office, with just myself and Raymond West as witnesses. Afterward, we all went to dinner in London, and it felt— She paused, searching for words. It felt like beginning again. But honestly this time, no secrets, no pretenses, Miss Marple inquired. He has, in a way. He's been consulting on several cases involving historical injustices, people whose convictions may have been unsafe, that sort of thing. He says it's his way of making amends for his own silence. He was never that, Lavinia said firmly. He was simply afraid, and fear makes cowards of us all at times. Marion nodded, then turned to Miss Marple. I want to thank you, Miss Marple. Without your intervention, Gerald would still be free, Father would still be tormented by guilt, and Celia would still be trapped in fear. Nonsense, dear. I simply asked questions and observed patterns. But you knew which questions to ask, Marion insisted, and you knew how to listen to the answers. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their tea and watching a robin investigate the flower beds for worms. Lavinia asked quietly. I made some inquiries, Miss Marple admitted. He's serving his sentence at Dartmoor. The prison chaplain reports that he remains unrepentant, insisting that he's the victim of a conspiracy. Some people never accept responsibility for their actions, I'm afraid. How terribly sad, Marion said. Indeed, but that is Mr. Barton's tragedy, not yours. The conversation turned to lighter matters. Marion's plans to attend a library conference in Edinburgh, Lavinia's excitement about her new position in Bath, the upcoming village fete, where Mrs. Bantry was organising a garden party competition. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the gathering took on the quality of a benediction, a gentle marking of endings and beginnings. When Lavinia and Marion finally took their leave, embracing Miss Marple with genuine affection, the elderly detective felt the particular satisfaction that comes from witnessing healing. Later that evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting and a cup of cocoa, Raymond arrived for his regular Tuesday visit. Aunt Jane, I've been working on a new novel based on the Barton case. Not too closely based, I hope, dear. Oh, I've changed everything. Different setting, different names, different relationships. Miss Marple smiled. That sounds very promising, Raymond. Raymond laughed. Actually, I've made her quite similar to you. Elderly, observant, underestimated by everyone around her. How very flattering. Not at all. I think there's something rather wonderful about an ordinary person who achieves extraordinary things simply by paying attention. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded her nephew with affection. "You're learning, dear? Though I hope your novel doesn't make detection seem too simple. The truth is that most of the time, justice is messy and incomplete. Gerald Barton was convicted, yes, but 23 years late. Arthur Penrose is still dead, and his death cannot be undone. The Fortescue family is healing, but they bear scars that will never fully fade." "But they're honest ones," Raymond countered. "And perhaps that's the best we can hope for. Not perfection, but honest acknowledgement of what was and what is," Miss Marple asked with a smile. Raymond leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Aunt Jane, do you ever wonder if it's worth it? All this involvement in other people's tragedies, all the darkness you expose?" Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, her needles clicking softly as she considered the question. Outside, the spring night was alive with small sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of night creatures, the eternal rhythms of the English countryside. "It weighs on me sometimes," she admitted. "But the alternative, allowing evil to flourish unchallenged, letting fear and silence corrupt good people, that would weigh on me more. We all have our roles to play, Raymond. Mine happens to involve paying attention to the small details that others miss, asking the uncomfortable questions, and believing that truth matters even when it's inconvenient." Raymond nodded slowly. "I understand." They sat together in comfortable silence, aunt and nephew, as the fire crackled and the spring night deepened outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries, new opportunities for truth to emerge from shadow. But for now, there was peace and the quiet satisfaction of justice, however delayed, however imperfect, finally served.